The Kuskokwim Range in interior Alaska does not care about you. That is the first thing you learn when you are posted out there. Not hostility, not menace, just a complete and total indifference to whether you live or die out there. The mountains were there before you arrived, and they will be there long after any record of you has faded, and they conduct their business accordingly. My name is Joel Briggs, and I showed up to that ranger station in September with a cracked duffel bag, $40 in my wallet, and 3 years of bad decisions behind me that made a remote Alaska posting look like a fresh start. I was 31, rough around the edges, 2 months out of a relationship that ended badly and a lease that ended worse. I had done backcountry work before, enough to know which end of a compass to trust, but I was no decorated outdoorsman. I was a man who needed somewhere to be that was far away from everywhere he had been. The ranger I was replacing had already left by the time I got there. No handover, no briefing, just a note on the kitchen table that said, "Food is in the chest freezer. Truck needs a new battery. Good luck." The kind of goodbye that told me everything I needed to know about how that person felt when they walked out the door. My partner for the posting was a woman named Dina. She had been at the station for 18 months already, which in that place felt like a lifetime. She was 40, lean and weathered in the way of someone who had spent more years outside than in, with hands that looked like they had fixed engines and split wood in equal measure. She did not smile when I pulled up. She looked at my cracked duffel bag and my clean boots and said, "You are going to need better boots than those." That was the warmest welcome she gave me for the first 2 weeks. The station sat at the edge of a valley that the locals did not have a name for. I found that out on my first supply run into the nearest town, a scatter of buildings and a gas station that passed for a settlement out there. I asked the man behind the counter at the general store what the valley was called. He looked at me the way people look at you when you have asked something that does not have a polite answer. He said they just called it the low ground. He said it like that was the end of the conversation and went back to whatever he was doing behind the counter. I mentioned it to Dina that evening. She was eating from a can at the kitchen table, not bothering with a bowl, and she shrugged and said the locals had good instincts about certain things and that not naming a place was one way of not belonging to it. I did not know what that meant yet. I found out later. The rule was on the inside of the station door. Masking tape, black marker, capital letters, "Do not look back," nothing else. No explanation, no signature, no date. Just those 4 words at eye level where you could not miss them every single time you walked out to start a patrol. I asked Dina about it my second day. She was outside splitting wood, and she did not stop swinging when I asked. She said it was a trail rule for the Northern Loop, the long patrol route that ran 8 miles through old spruce forest before coming back along the valley edge. She said it had been there when she arrived, and the ranger before her had told her to follow it without asking too many questions. I asked what happened if you looked back. She set the axe down and looked at me for a moment. She said she did not know from personal experience, and that she intended to keep it that way. Then she picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, and I understood that the conversation was finished. I followed the rule for the first 4 months without incident. The Northern Loop was a long, hard patrol, 8 miles of uneven ground through timber so dense the light came through in thin strips even at midday. The valley edge section was exposed, wind off the mountains hitting you sideways, the kind of cold that found the gap between your collar and your jaw no matter how you adjusted your gear. I did not enjoy that patrol, but I completed it every scheduled day, and I did not look back, and nothing happened. The trouble started in January. January, in that part of Alaska, is a specific kind of darkness. Not just the short days, though the days were very short, a quality to the dark that felt active, like it was doing something rather than just being the absence of light. The temperature dropped to the kind of numbers that turned your breath into a cloud before it left your mouth and made the spruce trees crack in the night like rifle shots. I was on the northern loop on a Tuesday, maybe 2 hours into the patrol, deep in the timber section where the trail narrowed and the trees pressed close on both sides. It was around noon, but the light was flat and gray, and the shadows under the trees were thick enough to lean against. I heard footsteps behind me, not animal footsteps, the weight and rhythm of a person walking, 2 feet, steady pace, maybe 30 yards back. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I stood there in the narrow trail, with my breath clouding in front of me and every instinct I had telling me to turn around and look. You hear someone behind you, you turn around. That is not a learned behavior. That is something built into you below the level of thought. I did not turn around. I stood there for what felt like a long time, and then I started walking again. After about 10 steps, the footsteps started again behind me. Same pace, same distance. 30 yards back, steady and unhurried, matching me stride for stride. I walked the remaining 6 miles of that patrol without turning around. I want you to understand what that cost. 6 miles with something behind you that you cannot see, that matches your pace when you walk and stops when you stop. That is close enough that on the quiet stretches between wind gusts, you can hear the snow compress under its weight. 6 miles of your body screaming at you to do the one thing you have been told not to do. I got back to the station and walked inside and sat down on the floor just inside the door and stayed there for a while. Dina found me there 20 minutes later. She looked at me and said, "Northern Loop?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Footsteps?" Or something else. I said, "Footsteps." She nodded like this was information she had been expecting and went to put the kettle on. She brought me a cup of coffee that was mostly coffee and a little bit of something from a bottle she kept in the cabinet above the stove, and she sat across from me and told me what she knew. She said it had happened to her twice in her first winter and twice more in her second. Always the northern loop, always the timber section, always footsteps, always behind, always matching pace. She said the ranger before her had described the same thing, and the ranger before that one, according to a journal she had found in the station, had written about it 3 times in one winter alone. I asked her what she thought it was. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked out the window at the dark valley. She said she thought it was something that lived in that timber, that had been there a very long time, and that had figured out, at some point before any of us arrived, that the best way to get a person to stop and turn around was to sound like another person walking behind them. I asked her if she thought it was dangerous. She said she did not know. She said nobody in the journals had ever turned around, so nobody knew what happened if you did. She said the fact that the rule existed and had been followed long enough to become masking tape on a door suggested that whoever wrote it had a reason, and that the reason was probably not a good experience. We sat with that for a while. I did the northern loop 11 more times before I transferred out. The footsteps came 4 more times. Same section of trail, same distance, same steady pace behind me. Once they came close enough that I could hear breathing, or something that sounded like breathing, ragged and slow, maybe 15 yards back. I did not turn around, not once. Not any of those times. But I want to be honest with you about something. The last time it happened, about 6 weeks before my transfer came through, the footsteps were closer than they had ever been, maybe 10 yards. And they stopped when I stopped and started when I started, and on one long flat stretch of trail, where the wind had dropped completely and the forest was absolutely silent, I heard something that was not footsteps and not breathing. It was a voice, low and formless, not words, just sound in the register of a voice. and it was coming from behind me, and it was close, and it went on for about 4 seconds, and then stopped. I kept walking. I looked at the trail in front of me, and I kept walking, and I did not turn around. I transferred out 6 weeks later. I told the incoming ranger about the rule on the door. I told him what it applied to and where on the trail it mattered most. I told him to follow it the way you follow a rule that was written by someone who learned the hard way what happens when you do not. He asked me what happens if you look back. I told him the same thing Dina told me on my second day. I do not know from personal experience, and I intend to keep it that way.